In 1969, football wasn't just a game for El Salvador and Honduras. It was a battlefield waiting to be ignited. The two neighboring nations, already embroiled in rising political tensions, economic struggles, and territorial disputes, found their anger spilling onto the pitch. What should have been a simple World Cup qualifier would soon become the trigger for an all-out war. The first match was set to be played in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, on June 8, 1969. The Salvadoran team arrived under hostile conditions, stepping onto enemy soil where resentment had been boiling for years. The streets were alive with nationalist fervor, but beneath the cheers and flag waving, there was a dangerous undercurrent of hate. The night before the match, the Salvadoran players found no rest, no peace. Honduran fans gathered outside their hotel, blasting car horns, banging on metal sheets, and screaming insults throughout the night. A psychological assault designed to break their spirit before they even stepped onto the field. By the time the match began, the stadium was a cauldron of chaos. Every pass, every tackle was met with jeers, whistles, and chants of war. As the Salvadoran players fought to keep their composure, their opponents played with an intensity fueled by something more than just competition. This wasn't just about winning. It was about defending national pride. Honduras scored late in the match, securing a 1-0 victory. But the final whistle didn't bring relief. It unleashed a storm. As the Salvadoran team left the stadium, bottles and stones rained down on them. Fights broke out in the stands, and on the streets, Salvadoran fans were attacked by enraged Honduran mobs. For El Salvador, this was more than a defeat. Back home, the nation plunged into mourning as if they had lost more than just a football game. Newspapers framed the loss as a national disgrace, and anger surged through the streets. Something had shifted. The match had ended, but the war had just begun. The morning after the 1-0 defeat in Honduras, El Salvador awoke to a nation in mourning. But this was no ordinary loss. It wasn't just a game. It was an attack on national pride, a humiliation broadcast for all to see. In bars, in homes, in the streets, rage simmered beneath the surface. Then, the tragedy that changed everything. That same morning, a young Salvadoran girl named Amelia Bolaños took a revolver from her father's drawer and, in an act of despair, ended her own life. She was just 18 years old. Her final words to her mother, "El Salvador has lost the match. There is nothing left for me." News of her suicide spread like wildfire. By evening, she wasn't just a girl. She had become a martyr. Her death was seized by politicians and the media who twisted grief into a weapon, transforming Amelia into a symbol of wounded national honor. Her funeral was unlike any other. A military escort carried her coffin through the capital, draped in the Salvadoran flag, while crowds wept and raged. The government used her story to fuel a dangerous nationalism, framing the football defeat as more than a loss. It was an injustice, an insult, a reason for revenge. As the sun set, the streets of San Salvador turned into a sea of anger. Anti-Honduran riots erupted, with mobs attacking Honduran-owned businesses, tearing down flags and setting fire to homes. Those who had once lived peacefully side by side now found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible war, one that had not yet been declared but had already begun. The next match against Honduras was coming. This time, it would be played on Salvadoran soil. But after that night, it was clear. This was no longer about football. It was about vengeance. June 15, 1969. The second match between El Salvador and Honduras was set to take place in San Salvador. But this was no ordinary game. It was a battle disguised as football. From the moment the Honduran team arrived, it was clear they were walking into hostile territory. The Salvadoran government made no effort to control the crowds, and thousands of enraged fans lined the streets, screaming insults and threats at the Honduran players. Their bus was pelted with stones and glass bottles, shattering windows, cutting players with shards of glass before they even reached the stadium. That night, the Honduran team couldn't sleep. Salvadoran fans surrounded their hotel, setting off fireworks, honking car horns, and chanting all night long, an act of revenge for what their own players had endured in Tegucigalpa. Some Honduran players would later admit that by morning, they were so exhausted and terrified, They could barely stand. By the time they stepped onto the pitch, the stadium had become a pressure cooker of fury. Over 45,000 Salvadoran fans packed the stands, waving banners that mocked the Honduran flag, chanting threats and spitting at the players. The Honduran anthem was drowned out by deafening boos, and when their flag was raised, Salvadoran fans ripped down their own banners and set them ablaze, as if preparing for war. From the first whistle, the game was more like a battlefield than a sport. Every tackle was met with fury, every pass felt like a fight for survival. The Honduran players, drained and demoralized, barely put up a fight as El Salvador stormed through them, scoring goal after goal. When the final whistle blew, El Salvador had won 3-0, but the real battle was only beginning. As the Honduran players fled to their locker room, mobs of Salvadoran fans took to the streets looking for targets. Hondurans living in El Salvador were beaten, their homes attacked, their businesses destroyed. What had started as a football match had escalated into violence, and for many it was no longer about the sport. It was about payback. The final game was just days away, set to be played on neutral ground in Mexico. But with blood already spilled, no one knew if the real war had already begun. June 26, 1969. The decisive third match between El Salvador and Honduras was set to take place in Mexico City on neutral ground at Estadio Azteca. But by now, this was no longer about winning a ticket to the World Cup. It was a battle for national pride, vengeance, and something far more dangerous brewing beneath the surface. The tension in the air was thick with hatred. Both governments treated the match as a matter of national survival, sending high-ranking politicians, military officials, and intelligence agents to the game, as if a war would be settled on the pitch rather than the battlefield. The players were no longer just athletes. They were soldiers in a symbolic war. Security at the stadium was tighter than ever, but that didn't stop the two sets of fans from clashing in the stands. Fistfights erupted before the game even began, and in the streets of Mexico City, bars and hotels reported brawls between Salvadorans and Hondurans, some ending with serious injuries and arrests. Even thousands of miles away from their homelands, the anger and violence had followed them. When the game kicked off, it was clear. This wasn't football, this was war. Every tackle was brutal, every foul was intentional, and the referee struggled to keep control. At times, the game seemed on the brink of collapsing into an outright brawl. El Salvador played like men possessed. They attacked relentlessly, pushing forward as if their very survival depended on it. And then, in extra time, the decisive moment arrived. Mauricio Pipo Rodriguez struck the ball past the Honduran goalkeeper, sealing a 3-2 victory for El Salvador. But there was no celebration, only rage and despair. As the Salvadoran players lifted their arms in triumph, the Honduran team stormed off the field, refusing to shake hands. The stadium erupted into chaos, with riot police forced to intervene as fans threw bottles, fought in the aisles, and ignited flares. Back home, things were about to turn deadly. Within hours of the final whistle, the Honduran government cut all diplomatic ties with El Salvador. On the surface, it was a political move, but to many it was a declaration of war. The matches had ended, but the real conflict had only just begun. And in just 18 days, the first bombs would fall. The war didn't start with an invasion, it started with silence. After El Salvador's victory in the third match, Honduras responded with a drastic move. They cut all diplomatic ties with El Salvador on July 14, 1969. It was a clear message. The rivalry had spilled beyond the football pitch and into the halls of power. But the truth was, football had only been the spark. The real fire had been burning for years. For decades, Honduras had struggled with land disputes. Thousands of Salvadoran migrants had settled in Honduras, farming land that local Hondurans claimed as their own. The Honduran government, under pressure from its people, had started evicting Salvadorans, fueling resentment that had been boiling beneath the surface. Now, after the brutal football matches, this resentment exploded into open violence. Across Honduras, Salvadoran immigrants became targets. Their homes were burned, their businesses looted, their families attacked. Stories spread of lynchings, assaults, and mass deportations. An estimated 300,000 Salvadorans were caught in the crossfire, many fleeing for their lives back to El Salvador. Their only crime, being born on the wrong side of the border. El Salvador's government couldn't ignore this crisis. Newspapers called it a humanitarian catastrophe, painting Salvadorans as victims of ethnic cleansing. But in government circles, a different conversation was happening, one about revenge, military strategy, and war. Tensions reached a boiling point when Salvadoran refugees arrived at the border in horrific condition. Some beaten, others missing family members, their homes destroyed. The Salvadoran military had seen enough. On July 14, 1969, President Fidel Sanchez Hernandez held an emergency war council. The decision was made. At 6 p.m., the order was given. Within hours, Salvadoran fighter jets were in the air. The football war had begun. July 14, 1969, 6 p.m. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the skies over Central America turned deadly. El Salvador's Air Force took off, their mission clear: strike first, strike hard, and cripple Honduras before they could retaliate. El Salvador, despite being the smaller nation, had a surprising advantage. It had a stronger, better-equipped Air Force. Their planes, mostly modified civilian aircraft and outdated fighter jets, were old but still deadly. The Honduran Air Force, by contrast, was outnumbered and ill-prepared, relying on a handful of aging World War II-era aircraft. The first target, Toncontín International Airport in Tegucigalpa, home to Honduras Military Air Base. At exactly 6:20 p.m., Salvadoran bombers roared over the capital, dropping their payloads onto the runways and hangars. Explosions rocked the city as Honduran anti-aircraft guns opened fire too late. The attack was a devastating surprise, forcing Honduras to scramble its remaining aircraft in a desperate defense. At the same time, Salvadoran ground forces surged across the border, invading western Honduras in a blitzkrieg-style assault. Thousands of Salvadoran soldiers, fueled by years of tension and revenge, pushed into the departments of Ocotepeque, La Paz, and Intibucá, meeting little resistance at first. The plan was simple: take key towns, destroy supply lines, and push towards the capital before Honduras could regroup. For the civilians caught in the crossfire, terror unfolded in real time. Farmers fled their fields, families abandoned their homes, and entire villages erupted in flames as the Salvadoran military advanced. In the skies, Honduran fighter pilots, many flying World War II-era Corsairs, tried to fight back against the Salvadoran assault. Dogfights broke out, with bullets tearing through the clouds as both sides fought for air superiority. But the war had only just begun. The next 24 hours would decide everything. Would El Salvador's shock and awe attack force Honduras into surrender? Or was Honduras about to launch a counterattack of its own? July 15, 1969. The morning after the invasion, El Salvador's initial attack had been devastating, but Honduras wasn't about to surrender. Overnight, the Honduran military regrouped, and by dawn, they were ready to strike back. The war had entered its deadliest phase, one of bloodshed, desperation, and brutal close-quarters combat. El Salvador had captured key towns in western Honduras, but their forces were spread thin. They had gambled on a quick victory, but now they faced a nation fighting for survival. At sunrise, Honduran troops launched a counteroffensive in the border region of Nueva Ocotepeque. Using local knowledge of the terrain, they ambushed Salvadoran units, forcing them into chaotic, brutal skirmishes in the hills and jungles. With limited ammunition and no clear supply lines, the Salvadorans suddenly found themselves on the defensive. In the skies, the Honduran Air Force finally retaliated. Despite their outdated World War II-era Corsairs, Honduran pilots fought with deadly precision, strafing Salvadoran positions and bombing key supply routes. In one legendary dogfight, a Honduran Corsair shot down a Salvadoran fighter jet, proving that the underdog still had bite. The skies over Central America became a battlefield, with both sides exchanging fire in fast, furious aerial duels. El Salvador's initial air superiority was slipping, and the war was becoming a grinding, brutal fight. But the ones who suffered the most? The civilians. Entire villages were flattened as both sides bombed towns and supply centers. Thousands of Honduran refugees fled their homes, desperately crossing rivers and mountains to escape the carnage. In El Salvador, Propaganda filled the airwaves, painting the war as a glorious fight for national pride. While in Honduras, civilians were urged to resist the invasion by any means necessary. With casualties mounting on both sides, it became clear this war wouldn't be over in a single day. What had begun as a short, sharp invasion was now becoming a war of attrition, and in the halls of power, both governments faced a terrifying question. How far were they willing to go? July 16 to 18, 1969. The war was supposed to be quick. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare. El Salvador had expected a swift victory, but Honduras refused to collapse. Instead, the conflict spiraled into a hellish four-day war, one that would claim thousands of lives and push both nations to their breaking points. El Salvador's military had made impressive gains in the first 48 hours, capturing key towns and pushing deeper into Honduran territory. But their advance was running out of steam. Supplies were dwindling. With no proper logistics, Salvadoran troops struggled with food, ammunition, and fuel shortages. The terrain became their enemy. The deeper they pushed into Honduras, the tougher the landscape became. Rugged hills, dense jungles, and winding roads made large-scale attacks difficult. Honduran forces fought back with renewed strength. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Salvadoran supply lines and launching hit-and-run attacks that exhausted the invading army. What was supposed to be a fast war was now becoming a brutal war of attrition. Honduras had been slow to react at first, but now they unleashed their full aerial might. Their World War II-era Corsair fighters, though outdated, proved to be lethal in skilled hands. Honduran bombers attacked Salvadoran airfields and supply depots, crippling their ability to maintain the offensive. Key bridges were destroyed, cutting off Salvadoran reinforcements. Salvadoran cities near the border, including Santa Ana, were now facing Honduran air raids, forcing civilians to flee. Suddenly, El Salvador was losing the skies, and with it, the war. Civilians face a nightmare. The war was supposed to be about land and national pride, but for civilians it was pure horror. Entire villages burned. Some were bombed, others were set ablaze by retreating forces to deny resources to the enemy. Refugees flooded the roads. Nearly 100,000 civilians were forced to flee, many leaving everything behind. The dead piled up. More than 3,000 people, mostly civilians, would be killed in the conflict. By July 17, the world was watching in shock. The Organization of American States, OAS, scrambled to intervene, fearing that if the war continued, the death toll would skyrocket. The OAS issued a demand for an immediate ceasefire, but neither side was willing to back down. El Salvador wanted a decisive victory. Honduras wanted to repel the invaders at any cost. And then, on July 18th, as both sides prepared for the next brutal day of fighting, something unexpected happened. A desperate last-minute agreement was being brokered, one that might finally end the bloodshed. July 18th, 1969. The war had raged for 4 days, leaving thousands dead, towns destroyed, and both nations pushed to their limits. But just as the world feared the conflict would spiral into an even greater catastrophe, a desperate intervention was made. By now, the international community, especially the Organization of American States, OAS, had seen enough. The brutal images of burning villages, dead civilians, and wounded refugees flooded the media. If the war continued, it would devastate both nations beyond repair. The United States, worried about instability in the region, pressured both governments to stop the fighting. The United Nations condemned the war, calling it a tragedy that should never have happened. Other Latin American nations, fearing the conflict could spread, urged an immediate ceasefire. With their armies exhausted, both Honduras and El Salvador realized they couldn't sustain the war much longer. But there was a problem. Neither side wanted to be the first to back down. The last-minute peace agreement, behind closed doors, intense negotiations began. The OAS sent representatives to both capitals, demanding that the fighting stop immediately. Honduras, despite being caught off guard in the early days, now held a defensive advantage. El Salvador's supply lines were stretched thin, and their forces were struggling to maintain their offensive. On July 18th, a fragile ceasefire agreement was reached. El Salvador would withdraw its troops from Honduras, but only under international supervision. Honduras would ensure the safety of Salvadoran refugees who were still inside the country. Both nations agreed to future peace talks to settle their disputes. At 6 p.m., after 100 hours of war, the guns finally fell silent. A war that never truly ended. The ceasefire may have stopped the shooting, but the hatred and wounds remained. El Salvador felt betrayed. Many Salvadorans believed they had been forced into surrender just as they were about to win. Honduras remained bitter. Though they had resisted invasion, their country was left devastated. Tensions with Salvadoran immigrants remained high. The border dispute was never fully resolved. Even though the war was over, the hostility between the two nations would last for decades. The football war had ended, but in the hearts of many, it had never truly stopped. And in the years that followed, both nations would pay the price for their brief, bloody war. The guns had fallen silent. The war had officially lasted just 100 hours, but its impact would haunt El Salvador and Honduras for decades. The final battle wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the economy, diplomacy, and in the hearts of the people who lived through the war. The human cost, lives lost, families shattered. Over 3,000 people had died, the majority of them civilians caught in airstrikes, bombings, and brutal ground combat. Entire villages had been wiped out, either by direct attacks or as scorched earth tactics to deny resources to the enemy. Tens of thousands of refugees fled their homes, leaving behind their land, their families, and everything they had ever known. One of the most heartbreaking consequences was the fate of Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras. Before the war, around 300,000 Salvadorans had been living in Honduras, many of them poor farmers who had moved there in search of land and work. After the war, they became targets. Thousands were expelled from Honduras in acts of violent retaliation. Others were hunted down by angry Honduran mobs, burned out of their homes, or executed in revenge killings. Those who survived had to walk back to El Salvador, often on foot, through a wasteland of destruction. The political fallout, a war with no winners, both El Salvador and Honduras emerged from the war, weaker, not stronger. Honduras won the war militarily, but its economy suffered from the destruction and the loss of Salvadoran laborers. The government became more authoritarian in the following years, using anti-Salvadoran sentiment to maintain power. El Salvador felt humiliated, believing that they had been forced to surrender when they were on the verge of victory. This led to growing instability, which would later erupt into a full-blown civil war in the 1980s. The border dispute remained unresolved for over a decade, and only in 1992, after a ruling by the International Court of Justice, was the border officially redrawn. Even today, tensions between the two countries remain. The legacy, a war over football, or something more? The football war was never really about football. The matches may have been the spark, but the fire had already been burning for years. This was a war about land, identity, and deep-rooted political tensions. The war exposed the fragility of nationalism, proving how easily emotions could be manipulated into violence. In the end, both nations lost far more than they gained. The football war remains one of history's most bizarre conflicts, a war that started with a soccer match and ended in bloodshed, exile, and lasting scars. So the next time someone says, "It's just a game," remember this war, because sometimes a simple match can change history forever.